And I'm in Evanston, Illinois. If you could open up your chat and direct it to all panelists and attendees, and just say who you are and where you're joining from. Judith is here with us from Connecticut. We're streaming live on YouTube. And this is Be Strong Families webinar series, Staying Strong and Positive for Ourselves and Our Children. Hi, Michelle. Hi, Andrew from Minnesota. Hi, Michelle from Western New York. Greetings. And hi, Sarah from Massachusetts.
Sarah.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. Hi, Tammy. Tammy's back. we have a smaller group today with us because of, I'm sure because of the holidays, but this will also be available on our YouTube channel and also on our website. Hi, Dustin. And we'll go to the next slide, Andrew, and get started because we have a lot to do today. I am here with Judith Ehrman Shapiro, almost PhD from the California Institute of Integral Studies. And she will introduce herself at greater length, but we're in part 4 of her 4-part series, A Corrective Perspective on Empowerment After Trauma. 9 Steps to Freedom. And I'm just delighted with what we've got to wrap up today. Before we get started with that, just want to remind people about the ways to engage. You're already using the first and primary one, which is the chat. The chat is yours. You can type in at any time during the presentation, questions, comments, talk to each other via the chat. It's yours. The other way that you can be heard is to raise your hand. And if you raise your hand, Andrew, who's in the background, I said, he's in the background, he'll unmute you and then you'll be able to talk. You'll need to unmute yourself. Awesome. Hi, Sandra. Good to be with you again.
Hi, Sandra.
Next slide. Just to remind people, whenever Be Strong Families does anything, we have agreements, and the agreements for our webinars are speak from your own experience, use I statements, treat other people the way you want to be treated, and please be here with us now. And whenever we have a topic that's a little bit potentially triggering, we also say a little add-on, if you need a minute, take a minute, which is just take care of yourself, mind your mind and your body, and if you need to step away and come back. If you agree to these agreements, do like our regulars are doing and type I agree in the chat, and then I will turn it over to Judith and we'll get started.
Hi everyone. This is part 4 of our webinar series and I'm so glad that you're here. I am going to present today about empowerment after trauma, and we're finishing up a set of 9 steps that are not linear. And what that means is that you can do these steps in any order whatsoever. And I like to start out by saying a little thing about my location. So I am a therapist and I am also a trauma survivor. My life was affected by homicide. But this webinar is much broader than that one topic. Your trauma could have been many, many different things, and I'm hopeful that this program will be helpful for you. We've been starting our programs with what I call a grounding invocation, because sometimes when we talk about trauma, we get triggered, meaning that our anxiety begins to kind of get a little stronger. You may feel it in a body sense, like in your stomach, your heart, your body, and you may feel it emotionally, or your thoughts may kind of almost involuntarily go back to your own experience. All of that is very normal to be triggered by how this is relevant to you. And we talked about the Eastern perspective, which is that our body grounds us in the earth, and our spirit from heaven or from above. And sometimes the spirit begins to separate and go out of the body when we experience trauma. So by grounding ourselves in the body, it actually helps in a preventative way, helping us be a little more resilient towards those experiences. So I'd like to take just a few minutes now to just sit back in your seat if you can. And it's fine if you're lying on the ground, or even if you feel a need to stand right now. Maybe you've been sitting all day, I don't know. But wherever you are, get comfortable. See if you can really put the soles of your feet onto the earth. Maybe even rolling your feet from heel to toe, from toe to heel for a few times, or stamping your feet a little bit, just to really feel that grounded connection through the soles of your feet. And take for a moment an opportunity to lower your eyes, even with an invitation to close them if that's comfortable for you. You never have to close your eyes, but just to soften your gaze. And bring your attention just for a moment back to the breath. This morning I heard the phrase, be patient with your breath. And I thought it was quite lovely. Be patient with your breath. Allow the breath to be drawn into your body. Feel the fullness of the breath in your abdomen. And when you exhale, just allowing the breath to leave patiently, openly, and then watching how that experience repeats itself. Allowing the body to fill with breath. Just detaching for a moment from the busyness of the day. Just a few moments here to feel the body. Feel the jaw, see if there's any tension in your jaw or your neck or your shoulders. Allow those areas to sit heavy, and notice your spine all the way from your shoulders down to your tailbone. Just allowing the body to be strong and sit heavy. And all we're going to do is take 2 more deep sets of breath, just like that. Allowing the breath into your body, being patient with its rhythm, and allowing the chest to fall and the abdomen to empty. And 1 more full cycle, just like that. Full breath in, and then exhale. Becoming aware now of the environment around you. Maybe allowing your eyes to raise or to open. See if you can maintain that feeling of calm or calmer as you take in your surroundings. Just from that place of detachment, of cool, calm, allowing. Okay. So Andrew, we're ready to start up those slides again. What we're going to do now is just do a quick review of where we've been. This is called a corrective perspective on empowerment after trauma. And we're presenting 9 steps that can be done in any order to help you feel more free, more liberated in your perspective, how you think about the trauma experience. Next slide, please. In the first time we met, we defined trauma, and we really took some time to do that. We defined trauma as a reaction to wounding, not an illness or a pathology or a sickness. And we talked about how complex the trauma experience really is. Next slide, please. All of this information, by the way, you can get in the first recording, part 1 of the webinar. We talked about how we need to correct our perspective, how we see things, because trauma has been medicalized in our experience. And very often we're taught that there's something wrong with us, something has to be fixed. And we're taking a different perspective here. We're taking a perspective where the survivor themselves, you and I and the people around us, we get to name what our experience is, what our needs are, what our strengths is, and what we have to do to heal. Next slide, please. This is an overview of the framework that I've presented. We're actually on the last 3 steps. Next slide, please. And that first day, all we did was this one step, which is we talked about how trauma is transformative, that it's going to change your life in a way that you have to find a new way of balancing, and in a way that we don't really return to how we've been, homeodynamic versus homeostatic. Next slide, please. So in the next webinar, we went through 2 more steps. First of all, we talked about requiring an understanding of the survivor's location, which is just that each of us have come to trauma from a different place where we're unique. We have different cultural backgrounds, we have different developmental backgrounds, and thank goodness we have different personalities from one another. That's what makes the world so interesting. But because of all these different ways of being in the world, it's really important to know where people come from. And people have to understand that about you if they're going to understand how you've experienced trauma. Next slide, please. And we also talked about this, how important it is that that is acknowledged. We acknowledge each other's truth. We acknowledge that people have an experience, that you can't coerce them or shame them into experiencing trauma in the way we're told. We experience it in the way it happened. We talked about radical inclusivity, which is admitting that we all have a different truth of what trauma is. Next slide, please. So in part 3, what we did is talk about the next 3 steps. We talked about validating each part of our experience in a non-hierarchical experience framework. And what that means is we have a physical experience, we have an emotional experience, we have thoughts, we have behaviors, and we have energy. And no one part of that is more important than another part of that. So we're taking a more holistic viewpoint of trauma. Next slide, please.
Wait. Because one of the other things about that one, about the holistic piece, was we included non-ordinary experiences. We included spiritual understandings as real and as important as any like medical diagnosis, right?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. It's so important. We absolutely honor what happens to us spiritually. I think it's very important to say that. And we did talk about that a little. Okay, next slide, please. We also talked about empowering the survivor as a co-creator. And we said, we're talking about the future. We're talking about something called anchoring to the future. We're not going to talk about why things happened, blame, or causality. What we want to recognize is our ability to have free will now in how we look at the experience and the actions we take now. And we said that week, the word of the week was sovereignty, meaning that we are primary in our own experience. We are the kings and queens of our own experience. We need to reestablish we have that power and that we have that responsibility to ourselves and to those around us. So anchoring to the future as a co-creator. Next slide, please. And the last thing we did last week is we talked about reductionism. And we talked a little bit about how when we think that trauma is all about pathology, meaning we think about trauma is all about the bad things, what is wrong with us, the way we suffer, then we've really left out this whole other part of our experience, which is the way that we gain experience, the way we deepen in our empathy and our passion, our compassion for other people. And we often let go of the fact that people are tremendously resilient and survivors. So we don't want to reduce trauma to that simple idea of illness. So now we're ready for this week. Next slide, please.
You got there pretty fast, Judith.
Thank you. I was trying really hard. And anyone who feels like, what did she just say? Don't worry, it's in the recordings. This week, we're beginning with this step, which is allowing the survivor's trajectory to be open-ended, emancipatory, and creative. So we need to begin by defining what a trajectory is. A trajectory means the path you've taken to get right here, right now. So it's a description of what's happened to us. We all have a different trajectory, and we all have a unique path through trauma. But what we've studied is that there are 5 common trajectories. So there's a trajectory called recovery, which is we start out in one place, we have the event of our trauma, and we're able to come close to where we've been. Maybe our mood gets a little better, or we're able to process what's happened to us. And some people experience this as recovery. But equally, there are people who experience either chronic depression or chronic grief. And what that means is that after the event of the trauma, we continue to have grief for a longer period of time than you might think is normal. Of course, we've already established there is no normal, but it's called chronic grief because it goes on for a long time. And likewise, chronic depression, for people who had depression before their trauma occurred, very often that's a state that goes on, right? It stays that way, and it's almost fortified by that experience of trauma. But guess what? There are people who experience improvement, and we've shown that scientifically. What that means is before the event of trauma, maybe things were going around okay, your mood was okay, you experience your trauma, but afterwards, some people actually thrive better. They're more purposeful in their lives, their mood improves, they feel more connected to their neighbors, their community, their God, spirituality. So improvement is an actual pathway, trajectory after trauma that is recognized scientifically. And the last of the big 5, we'll call them, is called resilience. And what those are those unique individuals that just spring back from everything. And partly, people talked about this in the chat last week, partly it's because they've experienced so much in their life and they are survivors. So when something bad happens, they do what's natural for them, which is they spring back, and they spring back pretty quickly. And that's a trajectory. And although these are the big 5, it doesn't mean that there aren't multiple other pathways that people take. What I want to say to you is that in my own research, so I just finished doing a big research project on life after homicide. What I discovered is that we may also have trajectories of thriving, and we have trajectories of creativity. Why is creativity so important? Why do I even bring it up? Because creativity is what helps us adapt, to begin again, to find new solutions, new purposes, and new roles in our lives. And what I found in my own research is, yes, we have trajectories of depression, but we also have trajectories of thriving. And it's equally important to talk about these. These trajectories are multi-directional, And this is important, so I'm going to describe it. What it means is that all these different trajectories can go in different ways at different times for different people. So I'm going to give you an example. Say for Kathy, after she experiences trauma, by the way, this isn't true, I'm making this up. Kathy becomes more depressed, and maybe she's depressed for a really long time, but maybe her thriving trajectory also increases at the same time. Maybe she's able to thrive while feeling depressed. But for me, maybe there's a different story there. Maybe my trajectory is also like a chronic grief or a long time period of grief, but maybe I can't thrive while I'm experiencing grief. So my thriving goes down while my grief goes up. Those are different directions, and there are multiple directions they can go depending on who you are. One more important fact about trajectories before we get off of this topic is that just because your path has been a certain way does not mean it's going to stay that way. And that's what I mean by your trajectory has to be open-ended. Just because I've been depressed for a long time does not mean I'm always going to be depressed. Or maybe I've recovered for now, but maybe in a few years I get triggered and I have a prolonged period of grief again. Your trajectory has to be open-ended to allow you the possibility to respond in an authentic or real way to what's happening to you. So here are my 3 questions for you. And we're going to do this a little different this week so that we can get to our final 2 steps. My first question for you, so you don't have to feel a need to respond to this, but you may want to in the chat. And Kathy is going to watch that chat in case something comes up there. Question 1 is, are you aware of how experiencing trauma has altered your mood or your sense of thriving? So do you have an awareness of that as a pathway? And do one of these 5 trajectories, did you say when I was talking about them, oh, that's me? So which of these trajectories do you relate to, or none at all? So sometimes it's helpful to look at the trajectories and say, oh yeah, that was something I related to. Question 3 is, what do you think creativity has to do with this step? So what does creativity have to do? Why is it important to notice creativity? So I'm just going to give a minute or 2 in case anyone wants to respond, and then we'll go on to the next.
And I'll respond briefly. I was thinking about this. There's a word that's been in the back as you were, the last 2 slides actually, and it has to do, the word is meaning and making meaning out of your experiences, whatever your experiences are. And I feel like that's part of what creativity is. It's interacting with the experiences that you go through in life and making meaning from them, which can contribute to resilience, can contribute to a sense of purpose, can contribute to improvement, you know. But so I think that's one aspect of creativity, which isn't like creativity like doing art or, you know,
exactly
writing a poem, you know.
No.
Others in the group. Judith, I'm just like having difficulty counting. So are these trajectories are things that psychologists have named, right?
Right.
So one of them is recovery, one of them is chronic depression or grief. One is
no, that's actually 2 of them. So chronic depression is one, or chronic grief is another.
Oh, okay. That's where I was getting to 5.
Okay.
Didn't know if the thriving in creativity was acknowledged or not.
Right. So the 5 are recovery, depression, chronic grief, improvement, or resilience. Does anyone want to guess which one of these 5 is the single most common according to researchers? Can anyone guess?
What do you think? You can just write it in the chat. Recovery, resilience. Tammy says resilience.
Tammy is correct. So most people think, a lot of people think recovery is the number one, but they have researched disasters, 9/11 they researched, they have researched tsunamis, they've researched bereavement, and again and again and again, the single most common among human beings is resilience. Good on you, Tammy. That is true, which doesn't mean you have to be resilient or feel that's part of your journey.
Well, it also speaks to the ubiquity of trauma, really, like the amount of difficult things that people all over the world go through, you know, that there's.
Right. And the last thing I'll say about trajectory, but please write in the chat if you want to say anything before we go on, is that, you know, a long time ago when they began studying how trauma or bereavement affects us, they believed we all went through the same steps at the same time. And when they started doing scientific research on social science research, they found that that was so not true. So it's just not helpful to tell people you're going to go through this phase, because they may not, and they may still have a good outcome.
So you're talking about like Kubler-Ross and the stages of
Kubler-Ross, which, you know, she did not present it as everyone is going to do that. That's what was done with her work. But interestingly, we could talk about her. But yes, it's Kubler-Ross, like the stages of grief, they're helpful because a lot of people, they're common, but they are not meant to be like linear. Like we go through all these stages.
Like you have to, like if you miss one, then you're not doing it right.
Correct, correct. So now research has moved to trajectories. This is the one that seems to capture what happens to us as a pathway after we experience trauma. Let's go to the next slide. So the next step, and it's not the next step, our next step is, I call it holding the commonalities of trauma lightly. I'm just looking at Tammy's.
Tammy says, I think resiliency was absolutely present. However, I didn't recognize it at the time. Certain chronic depression was prevalent. Looking back, I see how resilient I was. I was able to continue doing what needed to be done throughout the years of abuse.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting, Tammy, you say that way, because when I think of my own journey, I also think about it as a combination of like chronic grief, improvement, and resilience. Like I couldn't choose one of those paths. I just asked you to do something I couldn't do myself. But we're very often, people try to be right, but people try to make it out as it's simplistic. And it's not. It's three-dimensional. It goes many different places at once.
I like what Tammy's saying also, because I can feel it being layered. Like I can feel like at the exact same time. It's not like they were alternating. It was like she was feeling chronically depressed at the same time as she was putting one foot in front of the other to make things happen in her life, which is resilience. You know?
To survive. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So this is where I need to give some props to a man who is both Kathy's teacher and mine. Jorge Ferrer is known as a participatory thinker. So the participatory theory, this is a participatory framework. And he's a Spanish psychologist. Like I said, he's a teacher of both Kathy and mine. He's the one who used the phrase holding commonalities lightly. I added trauma. So what we were talking about is it's really important to acknowledge the part of what we experience that's common among us. And at the same time, here's the paradox, right? And what is unique and individuated or based on context for each one of us. Commonalities are really important because they help us remain connected to understanding one another, and to help us understand that we're just not alone. And I've done more conversation during this webinar about how we're different and I want to take the opportunity to talk about how we're similar, but at the same time, we talk about, we hold that lightly because trauma is too complex. It's too complex to say, well, if it's common, what's wrong with me? That's not a good framework to have. Just because it's common, it may not define you or allow you the freedom to be real about what you're experiencing. And I only have one question for this, which is, what do you believe you share in common with other trauma survivors?
Well, I had a bunch of questions. I'm going to type this question in the chat for us, but what do you believe you share in common with other trauma survivors? And I had I just want to make sure I understand what you're talking about.
Sure.
I'm thinking about how I am there for people who are suffering, friends, you know, somebody that's very close to me, his mother just died. And
yes.
And I understand, I feel like the commonality is like I connect to the depth of her sadness because I have felt deeply sad myself, but I'm not telling her I feel what you feel, or I know how you're feeling, or you know, I'm just hearing her sadness and letting her talk about how she feels and letting it resonate in me. But the commonality is that I know I can feel in my heart what she's talking about. Is that what you're?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. And I think, you know, I'm interested actually in people's response to this, because I think we do share quite a bit in common with other people, and that's okay. That's good. I think a lot of the symptoms we experience, we share in common. Maybe not like you say in the same exact
Okay, so
way.
are you talking about here like fight and flight, or fight
Sure.
and flight and freeze? You know,
sure.
like,
Yes, that's a biological similarity we all
like
have.
I've
Right?
been in fight or flight. You know, I've been in freeze, and that's something that trauma survivors are familiar with. That. What other people? What do you believe you have in common with other trauma survivors? Maybe sometimes you feel like you've experienced the experience that someone else has. You know, so if you know, if two people have been traumatized, not to say that it's the same thing, or that we went over your location is different, your history, your context, your support, all of that is different. But if two people have been raped, they've both been raped.
Right.
You know, maybe they've both gone through a trial, you know, maybe not, you know.
Absolutely.
Sandra has her hand raised. Thank you, Sandra. You can talk. You need to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's on mute. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Just the commonalities, like you guys was saying. Thank you, Kathy and Judy. My commonality as a parent partner, that's one of the main reasons that we're hired as parent partners, or parent advocates, of relatability to families. And that's some of the commonalities that I have a lot, especially with parents who feel like they failed as parents, which that's a real commonality to me. Families that deal with gang activities is serious commonality with me. And so I do notice when you can relate to those things, you can get their attention a little bit better, even though they got the clinician and all that, because people feel you can't understand because you ain't been where I've been, you don't know anything, especially, you know, those commonalities is a help for people at least to get their attention. And you get, you know, the empathy part. Not saying again, you don't have to go through things to have empathy for people, but it is a more relief when someone says, I've been there. Pain is what it is, even though people handle it different in different things. Just feeling some type of pain from some kind of trauma is a commonality related to just help people can get through it. I don't like that word too much, to get over it, but how to learn how to live through it and make it and turn it around for something good in your life, in a sense. So just wanted to say that. So,
Thank you, Sandra.
Yeah, and I was hearing when Sandra was talking, it's like sometimes it's what you have in common with some trauma survivors is the context also. Like what Sandra is talking about is, I know the context in which you experience the trauma. I know what it's like to have a family that's like that, or a community, you know, to be discriminated against like that, or to have a community like that, you know, to be in a community. And the relatability, like the relatability of experience around the trauma as
Right.
well. Is that part of what you were saying, Sandra? Or did I just
oh, oh yes, yes, it's very important. I mean, I can say for me, coming from this is just me personally, and I had to learn some things. And coming from South Central LA, you Kathy, you know my story. Being in trauma, basically some type of trauma, and I had to look at what is trauma. It's like something we live in and different things. Didn't even understand it. So when I used to think people put it this way, lived on top of the hill, coming down here, never experienced these type of things, you couldn't tell me anything. You couldn't help me. You can't even imagine the struggle of this situation, the survival that we have to have, so you can relate. So if I heard somebody said, you know what, I from South Central LA in a sense, and been there and done that, and I made it out of it, it gives a hope that you felt hopeless before. So that it's a big help. It catches your attention to listen.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Sandra. We also have Tammy in the chat says, I feel that the big thing I have in common with other DV survivors is that we survived. Our experiences may have been totally different, but we persevered, we got out, we're no longer victims.
Yeah. So just
And
the act of survival.
yeah. And I feel like sometimes it's also just, I don't know, like maybe your experiences are different, but do you feel like there's a commonality, Tammy, in the feeling that happens when you, of having been through that? That type of, yeah, relatability.
Relatability.
Mm-hmm.
I think I really appreciate what Tammy and Sandra are saying, what you're saying, Kathy. It's funny because my mind went to, you know, when people talk about their relationship to their memories, like, you know, memories that come back and won't let you go, and come back when you're trying to do other things and get in your way. Like when people talk about that kind of struggle with memory, or struggle with feeling anxiety, or struggle with feeling certain things, like I relate to the feeling. It doesn't have to be the context, but I relate sometimes to, wow, I know what that's like to have your mind kind of taken over, or your body gets taken over by fear or anxiety, and you're pushing to get through it. So it's just another way that I feel sometimes a commonality with other people who are struggling.
Tammy says she spent several years working in a DV safe house after her experience. And I think it really helps that I experienced it. I wasn't just counseling for being trained. I think I understood things better than my colleagues who hadn't been there.
Yeah, I agree.
That's what Sandra was saying, like from the hill, like if you're going to come down from some clinical perspective and diagnose my trauma, you know, I'm going to tell you to go away.
I agree. I agree, which is why it's so important for people to listen to us, because, you know, unfortunately, we're in a big world where a lot of people have not experienced what we've experienced. So there has to be a way for us to connect, you know, there. And if anyone's telling you about your experience, it's a bad beginning. It's a bad road to go on. No one can tell you about your experience. No one's been where you've been. Any other comments about this? And we're on to our last slide of steps, and then we have a wrap-up slide. So this one I feel very strongly about, and I look forward to hearing your input about it. So this step is just so important. It's about emphasizing the importance of mutual respect among all actors. So in order to establish empowerment after trauma, it's so important for there to be respect. That's what we're talking about, right? Respectful relationships. But listen to the group I'm going to read here. Survivors, clinicians, members of the legal system, law enforcement, the community, and the media. All of these relationships have to contain an element of respect. If the respect isn't there, we can't even begin a meaningful conversation. Jorge Ferrar, who I encourage you to read his work, he said there are 3 tests. That's how he said, to know that you're on the right path towards this kind of outlook. The first one, he said, is it's important to look at your own motivation and to check for the misuse of the presence of vulnerability, despair, shock, and differentials of power. So when I'm in a situation and I'm working with other survivors, or if other people are working with me, you want to make sure that the fact that I'm vulnerable, that I'm shocked, and that there may be a differential in power here is something that is being looked at, and there's no misuse. So that's a very important test to see if we're all on the right path towards respect. The second one is it's important to ask how each relationship, interpersonal relationships, promote the holistic well-being of each person. So if you look again at that list, it includes each of these people in each of these locations, the legal system, law enforcement, the community, and the survivor. So how does that relationship promote well-being, no matter who it's between in this situation? And lastly, he said, it's important to promote fundamental human rights, principles of balance, right? Ecological principles of balance, social justice, and human equality amongst all of these people in all of these relationships. Listen, I know as well as you that this doesn't exist right now, but we have to have a vision to work towards so that we can create a world where this does exist. Mutual respect among all actors. So my question for you for this slide is, what does respect mean to you in the context of trauma?
I'm being quiet.
I don't believe it, Kathy.
What does respect mean to you in the context of trauma?
Well, I'm going to just
getting to it would be like to talk about when have you felt disrespected in the context.
Well, that's a good place to go. And I would go to the end of the last slide. Don't move it, Andrew. This is perfect. But we were saying that people have to listen. If people are not listening to your experience, if they're telling you about your experience, then you're not receiving respect.
Well, I think it's easier for me to get my arms around when have I felt disrespected in the context of trauma? Like, what do people do that is not respectful? And then I can work the other way around. So I could say minimizing it, you know, being patronizing about it or condescending about it.
Yes.
It's kind of what I see when you're over explaining it in their own terms so that it's taking away my interpretation of my experience, or telling me what's going to happen, telling me what's going to happen, what I need to do. Tammy says, I agree, being listened to and heard. I first went to my pastor at church about my situation. His response after hearing my story was, it isn't that bad, is it?
Oh my God, I feel shocked by that.
I'm sorry that happened to you, Tammy.
I am too. It's just, oh, wow.
See, but it's beyond being, I mean, I guess Tammy, where I'm going is like, he may have listened to you and he may have heard you, but he interpreted through his lens and judged, you know, and made a judgment and then put it back to you as a question. So it's a manipulation too, like being manipulated. And that has happened also, you know, like people who know your trauma and then use it to be able to get what they want from you or what they need from you, the manipulation. We later found out he was struggling with alcoholism himself.
So he was probably talking about himself when he spoke to you, which is, I find, very often what people do. Instead of really addressing you with a compassionate heart, they address whatever their own need is in the situation. And unfortunately, very often the need is not to be uncomfortable about your trauma, unfortunately.
Yeah, oh, there's TV commercials about that where parents are trying to talk to their friends about their child's drug abuse, and it's like they say, you know, how are you? How are the kids? And the one parent says really how the kids are. Well, we're really worried about Johnny because we found out that he's been, you know, cutting or something like that. And then the other parent says, doesn't know what to say. And it's like, oh, that's nice. Are you going to the country club next week? You know, like that kind of. So I'm just saying, like, where you can't, it's over, you get the feeling that it's too much, or it's not what people want to hear, or it's they don't have the bandwidth to deal with it.
Right. And of course, I'm sitting here thinking about the misuse of differentials of power, right? And I'm thinking about Black Lives Matter. You know, if my life doesn't matter to begin with, how can we even have a conversation about respect? Seriously. You know, I mean, if my life doesn't matter, if it doesn't matter if I could make it home, what are we talking about? We're talking about the misuse of the differentials of power. So, I mean, it's such a broken place in our society. It's just, and we need to address it. We have to address it. So,
what else about respect in the context of trauma?
So we can, this is a big one. Respect is a big one. I've heard all sorts of stories about, I was talking with a young lady the other day, and she was telling me that the first time she went to a psychiatrist was with her parents, and the psychiatrist never spoke to her. He only spoke to her parents. And I was thinking, oh my God, how disrespectful of her, just because she was young. I mean, it's mind-boggling.
Tammy says, I think a big part of respect is to avoid judgment. And then when you were up in the first bullet point, Judith, and you were talking about survivors, clinicians, members of the legal system and law enforcement, the community, and the media. And then you think of something like child welfare, like child abuse and neglect, and the judgments and the disrespect and the assumptions that are made about the whole situation on the part of the media, the community, law enforcement,
Yes.
legal system, clinicians, survivors, and others. It's a lot. And when the trauma is something that's a crime, I think like homicide, like you're talking about homicide or rape or something like that, then, and when all those factors are involved, then people's biases, I mean, unconscious or conscious biases, really come out about what happened.
Right. And sometimes, unfortunately, the media feeds on that. So that's why I included them in the list of how those respectful relationships that have to be developed in order for us to really experience mutual respect. Let's please comment if you have anything else to say. Yes, there's.
Tammy says people often say you should just. This is not helpful. They have no idea why you're making the decisions you're making, and it's often survival. And I would say there was, we had a webinar about DV earlier on, and Sandra's got her hand raised. So we can hear from Sandra. And then I encourage everybody to watch the DV webinar because there's very good information there, exactly to what Tammy is saying in terms of when people say you should leave or you shouldn't put up with that the most dangerous time in a DV relationship is when the person who's the victim decides to leave, and it's not safe to leave often. It's really not safe to leave. And so the avoiding the shoulds is very important. We have two hands raised, Sandra and Pamela.
Sandra is unmuted now.
Okay, Sandra, go for it.
Real quick, I just want to agree. I see the time, just agree. I can't deal with the typing. Thank you, Judith, for bringing it up the Black Lives Matters and different things, because that is a real big one. Even what Tammy is saying, just people who the totally disrespect is when people think you should just get over it, and then I had to learn maybe they just don't know what to say to hurt your feelings, and people not understanding, especially a Black woman that's in South Central. You hear a lot, with the Black Lives Matters, all lives matter. That's what people say. No, we're not saying that. I wish people would understand when their sons, their Black sons, are not being the ones executed for just no reason, trying to do the right thing. This happened to us. So when people don't really get that, we're not saying that all lives don't matter. All lives matter. But when you can look at the news and saying the majority of it happening to, is we're just saying we love our children like you love yours and our family. So I thank you for really bringing that out, because that make us as a Black race, and our race especially, make us feel like we are now being heard from everybody, and people are understanding this is a matter for everybody. It's just not the Black race, but it just happened to us more. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you so much, Sandra.
Pamela?
And Kathy, after Pamela, I'm going to move on to the last slide.
Okay. Pamela, did you want to talk? You're muted.
Hello, everybody. I'm sorry that I came in late. We had another all staff meeting with Department of Behavioral Health, and apologize. But what I've been listening to is very important. For people to get an understanding of what's going on about having respect among each other, and that I am, it's always important to voice your opinion so people can understand one another.
Thank you, Pamela.
Thank you, Pamela. And Andrew, we're going to go to the last slide. Okay, so just to kind of do a quick roundup, we don't like this, the graphic on this slide because it looks like steps, and we just said they're not steps. But the way I wanted to talk about this was to say you. So this is about us as survivors. We talked about recognizing trauma as transformative, to begin to understand where you came from, where I came from, where we came from, and to acknowledge the truth, the simple truth of what you experienced, and to validate all parts of your experience, all parts, to empower yourself as a co-creator in your own experience, and to discourage the limitation of the idea of trauma, because whatever it is you experienced is what trauma is. We need to allow our paths to change while recognizing where they've been, right? But that they can change. And to hold the commonalities which we have with one another lightly. They're important, but at the same time, what we experience may be different. And lastly, to emphasize mutual respect for all the people who may be involved in our trauma. This is the framework that we're working on changing, kind of a general viewpoint of trauma. If we can start here, we can begin to name the ways that we need to travel in order to receive healing for ourselves. Kathy, any last thoughts as we finish up?
Oh, I just want to thank you very much. Thank you for being here on this last day before the break. Thank you for this wonderful webinar series. It's available on our website and on YouTube. And I hope those of you who missed the first parts will dive in and just, I think it's really, really important. And I know that we're going to be collaborating on training and workshop on this topic as well. So I just want to encourage everybody to come back after the break. We are off. Be Strong Families is off for the week between Christmas and New Year's. And we encourage everybody to come back after the break. Alexis is going to be here on Monday with our January 4th with our elders and ancestors, wisdom, inspiration, and legacy. And then Sarita and I are going to be doing a more perfect union cafe conversation, how conversation can bring us together. And we're going to actually have breakout rooms for that one, which is a new thing for us on our webinars in the new year. Ahmed will be doing the last of his series on boundaries and healthy communication. And then Brazelton is going to be here to do a workshop on developing and sustaining relationships through virtual service delivery. And I think I really looked around the line. I know a lot of you provide direct services to families and are doing it, you know, in unusual ways due to the pandemic. And I really was digging around a lot in the virtual home visiting world and looking for resources for all of you. And so I think that's a really important one for you and for anybody who works with children and families. And then Carol Mizuguchi will be here on Friday, January 8th, and talking about allyship. Amplify, this is our social media campaign. What do we want to amplify coming out of this? We want to amplify. What do you want to amplify, Judith?
Amplify empowerment.
Yes, amplify empower, hashtag amplify empowerment after trauma. And then next slide. This
Resilience.
is like the last, what?
Resilience.
Amplify resilience. Awesome. So we have our Show Your Love campaign going on. It's our end of year. We've never done one before. There are specifically to support the webinars, which we have no funding for, and which we want to continue because we think you want to continue. So if you have enjoyed them, please go to our website and donate before the end of the year to be part of the Show Your Love campaign. And wear your mask. We have masks on our website if you want to express your value. It's the speech bubble butterfly is about transformation through conversation. And then we have the amplify, all these positive things: health, respect, unity, love. And these webinars are done by the community for the community. If you would like to do a webinar with me, if you would like to host or co-host or be part of holding space for conversation, write me. That's how many of us do it. And we've got Sandra, you should receive that today, I believe, right, Andrew?
Sorry, what was that?
Sandra said she didn't receive the emails for sign up for January sessions. We sent one out this morning, I believe. And
We sent that out yesterday.
Yesterday,
but we are also sending out an email next week as well.
and there will be one next week. So we hope to see you back here on January 4th, and wish everybody happy and healthy holidays.
Happy holidays, everyone.
Much love to all of you. And thank you, Judith.
Thank you.